Hello everyone, today I'm presenting on the bubonic plague. So whenever we think bubonic plague, usually our first thought is the massive outbreak in Europe during the Middle Ages. So in the year 1347, 12 ships from the Black Sea arrived in the Messina port, which is in Sicily, which is right here. And whenever the docking authorities went on board the ships, they realized that a majority of the sailors were dead, and those that were not dead, for the most part, were gravely ill. They had these black boils all over their bodies that were leaking blood and pus. So the Sicilian authorities immediately ordered the ships to leave, but it was already too late because over the course of the next 5 years, about a third of the European population would die due to the bubonic plague. And even before these ships arrived in the port in Sicily, there had been rumors of a great pestilence throughout the world. And as early as 1340, there are reports of it having struck China, India, Persia, Syria, and Egypt. And there's recently been some evidence that the bubonic plague has been around since about 3000 BC. This Italian poet, Giovanni Boccaccio, he lived during the time of the plague, and he said, quote, "In men and women alike, at the beginning of the malady, certain swellings, either on the groin or under the armpits, waxed to the bigness of a common apple, others to the size of an egg, some more and some less, and these the vulgar named plague boils." End quote. So the bubonic plague, it's terrifyingly efficient. People who were completely healthy one day, the next morning wouldn't wake up because they would have already died from the plague. In fact, children at that time, they wrote a song about this, right? We all know the song Ring Around a Rosie. So it's Ring Around a Rosie. Well, the roses are, they're a euphemism for the deadly rashes that the plague would bring about on its victims. And we've got a pocket full of posies. Well, posies is an herbal concoction people would put in their pockets as a sort of preventative measure from the plague. You would be breathing in those herbs instead of breathing in the bubonic plague fumes, which they thought at the time was what caused it. Then we've got a tissue, so those are sneezes due to the plague. And then we all fall down, obviously. We're all dead, so we're falling down. And then that same Italian poet, Giovanni Boccaccio, he said, quote, "The mere touching of the clothes appeared to itself communicate the malady to the touchers." They didn't really know how it was spread. They just knew in cities it was wiping people out left and right. So the plague doctors, they wore these, long masks, and they went and they collected the bodies and they burned them because at the time that was one of the few ways they knew to actually sterilize things. So they were hoping burning it would destroy whatever disease and it would stop the spread. And they would even burn some people alive because they didn't know how to prevent the plague at the time. Okay, so what do we know now about the plague in modern day medicine? So we know it's spread by this bacteria, Yersinia pestis. And Yersinia pestis, it's a gram-negative Coccobacillus bacteria, and it's non-motile. And it's spread by a flea. So this flea we have in the picture, it's of the genus Xenophacilla, and this particular flea is an oriental rat flea, which is, they think, the specific flea that caused that massive outbreak in Europe. And it hitches a ride on rodents. So the oriental rat flea hitched a ride on a rat on the ships. But nowadays we know any flea belonging to the Xenophacilla genus can hitch a ride on any sorts of rodents. So earlier this year, there was a patient in Colorado who the flea came from a squirrel. So it's really any rodent, rats, rabbits, mice, squirrels can carry the infected flea that has the Yersinia pestis bacteria. So whenever you have the bubonic plague, it's going to present itself in symptoms such as headaches, fever, chills and weakness, and buboes. And those buboes, so about 24 hours after you're bitten by the infected flea, the lymph node closest to the site of infection is going to become really inflamed and swollen, tender, painful. And it's going to present as this mass on your body. So if you're bitten somewhere down on your leg, let's say, it's going to present close to your groin is where that bubo is going to appear. And if you're bit on the arm, the bubo is going to appear in the armpit. And bubo, that's how we get the name bubonic plague, right? Because these masses would start appearing on the patient's bodies. So there are a couple different types of plague. There's the bubonic plague, like we just said, which has fever, headache, chills, and buboes. And if that's not treated, so if the infected lymph node, if it's not treated soon enough, that bacteria spreads throughout the body and it turns into the septicemic plague. And the septicemic plague presents itself, along with all the symptoms of the bubonic plague, with extreme weakness, abdominal pain, and bleeding into the skin and other organs. And that bleeding into the skin and other organs, the blood gets trapped in between the layers of the skin, and it becomes these black patches all over the patient. So back in 1350, whenever the plague was ransacking Europe, a perfectly healthy person would suddenly be presenting with these black splotches all over their body. So the bubonic plague became known as the Black Death. And if the septicemic plague is left untreated, it turns into the pneumonic plague. And the pneumonic plague, along with all the symptoms of the bubonic and the septicemic plague, it presents itself with things like shock and respiratory failure. So that's what's going to cause the death, is that pneumonic plague and not necessarily the bubonic or septicemic plague. So here we've got some pictures. So here in the bubonic plague, here's this bubo. So maybe this patient got bit further down the leg, but this swollen bit is presenting itself in the groin. And then here we've got a picture of the septicemic plague. So here you can see the blood trapped in the layers of the skin and these black patches, i.e. Black Death. And then lastly, we have a picture of the pneumonic plague. So this patient here is in respiratory failure, courtesy of the plague. So here we've got a map of the reported plague cases by country from the years 2013 to 2018. So for the most part, you can see it's in Africa. We've got a few random incidents in Europe and Russia, one in the US, and then a couple down in South America. But for the most part, they're in small agricultural areas of Africa rather than the large cities like they were and the outbreak in Europe. And that's because, well, where do we see the most rodents? We see them out in the country, and those rodents are the ones that are carrying the flea with the Yersinia bactis bacteria. So again, here we have a map. This is reported cases of plague in the U.S. from the year 1970 through 2018. And you can see it's mostly in the southwest of the U.S. We see northern New Mexico, southern Colorado. And that's because, so the plague was first introduced into the U.S. in the early 1900s, right? It came on steamships. So for the most part, it stayed in port cities. But then the species of rat that it was on, it migrated to the western United States, and that's where it still is. So that flea is now picking up on squirrels and rodents in that area. So now we see mostly in northern Arizona, southern Colorado, some in California, some we see a few in Oregon, right up here, and then we have a couple in Nevada. Here we have a graph. We've got cases on the y-axis and year on the x-axis, and this is human plague cases and death in the United States. So this light blue color, that would be just a normal case, the patient recovered, and in the dark blue, that would be our death. So for the most part, we don't get really above 7 cases per year. And then we have a few outbreaks like in 2006, and in 2018 we got up to 17 and 16 cases, but still not very many deaths in the US. So like I said, there's an average of 7 human plague cases per year in the US, and they occur in all ages and in all genders throughout the US. However, they're most common in males aged 12 to 45, and this is only slightly more common. And it's theorized that it's because males aged 12 to 45 years old are more likely to be outdoors, hunting, fishing, backpacking, whatever they do, and that puts them at higher risk for encountering rodents and the fleas and the Yersinia pestis bacteria. So how do you avoid the plague? Well, first option is pretty obvious. Don't go where the plague is prevalent. So if you're planning a vacation, do not go to rural Africa. If you see a sick or a dead animal, don't touch it, even if you think you have gloves and you can handle it. Report to the local authorities instead. Avoid contact with all rodents, even if they're healthy, so don't go pet the rabbit or the squirrel. Leave it alone. And then lastly, if you have any burrows or nests around your home or your workplace, eliminate those. Eliminate any sources of food that are going to attract rodents near your home or your workspace. What to do? You want to report any sick or dead animals to local authorities. Use veterinarian approved flea collars on your pets so they don't carry any fleas into your home. Regularly examine and treat your pets. So make sure you have those annual veterinary visits with your pets. And then lastly, follow all veterinary guidelines when treating sick animals. So whenever you contract the bubonic plague, you immediately want to go to a hospital because hospitals are way better at handling disease outbreaks than you are, right? You're going to go to the hospital, you're immediately going to be quarantined, and you're going to be set on an antibiotic regimen to counteract that Yersinia pestis bacteria. And remember, pneumonic plague, that's the one that causes respiratory failure. So you're going to be put on respiratory support with supplementary oxygen, and then they're going to pump your body full of fluids, so the intravenous fluids. And in the US, about 90% of people survive the bubonic plague if it's caught in time. And here are my references. I look forward to hearing whatever questions y'all have.